Thank you, Ole, for a very informative presentation. I wanted to touch on a couple of issues, just to dig a bit deeper into what you talked about, especially I think with costs and the transparency issues. But what I was wondering first is just to start with, why is you mentioned at the beginning that the PSA is kind of the key vehicle in determining how setting up a fiscal regime for extractive industries. So I was wondering, why are PSAs so popular?
That's a good starting question. I think the origin of this type of contract came out of frustration with government's frustration with companies, international companies, and now we're going back to the 1920s, 1930s, when certain companies got very large concessions to explore for oil and probably minerals at that time as well, and the return for the government was either non-existent or very, very meager. And this frustration then developed into a new type of relationship between governments and companies. And I think it was the Indonesian government that championed this in the 1940s, 50s, and Iran was another country where this was developed, where one no longer wanted to hand over large concessions to private companies to do what they wanted, but instead have a system whereby the operations, the upstream operations of exploration and production was handled by the company on behalf of the government. So basically what you have is the contractor or the operator is doing a service to the government, and for that service they are remunerated by getting a large proportion of the result of the production. And so in a sense it's all done for and on behalf of the government, whereas in practice, of course, it may look as if the oil company is taking care of the whole thing, but they're doing so on express instructions from the government involved. And from the company side, this type of document of contract has also been favored because it sets out in quite some detail the terms under which they can operate. And in many of the countries where, especially when this was developed in the as I said, 40s and 50s and on from there, the local regulation was not complete. So there was insufficient regulation of many of these aspects. So in a sense, you could look at the production sharing agreement. Some of these documents are more than 100 pages, 150 pages maybe. It's creating a small universe, a little legal system of its own. And with a strong belief in the sanctity of the contract, many of these companies have favoured the document, and so it's been a win-win in a sense. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. Speaking of favoring the companies, you mentioned a bit about the business secrets, or that are often a part of these, or what you call the old agreements. Are there government reasons for having these confidential?
That's quite an interesting question as well. Touches on my answer will touch on impertinence, I suppose, but I think that you have to distinguish between government interest in an ideal fashion and the interest of certain persons in a government. And I think that we have seen examples that certain persons in certain governments have been lavishly rewarded by keeping or have been able to be lavishly rewarded by keeping information about the proceeds of certain contracts. And one thing that I haven't really gone into is the aspect of signature bonuses, because that's a classic. Some governments have had inadequate systems for ensuring that, say, signature bonuses and other particular payments go into the state single account. And instead, we've seen sometimes that type of payment have gone to individuals rather than to the correct place, which would be the government coffer, the state accounts, basically. So yes, certain government persons, individuals in government, have been in favor of keeping things out of the common domain and keeping things secret. Whereas governments, as I see them, the governments that exist purely for the benefit of the people of the country, those have not been in an advantageous position by keeping secrets. I see few, I may be wrong, but I see very few reasons to keep things secret for the benefit of the government.
We talked a bit about cost eligibility, or eligibility in the cost oil part of the presentation. How detailed are these contracts or agreements usually on eligibility?
One thing that troubles me is that almost no matter how much detail you put into a contract, somebody will often find a weak point where the question is a little bit open, a little bit unsure, and where you can have a good discussion on whether a type of cost is eligible or not. But the setup in most PSAs is that you have clauses on enumerating the type of costs. Basically, the concept is that costs that help you come from a position of lack of development to a position where you can actually produce petroleum, those costs are eligible. That's basically the idea. Anything that helps you get to the target, which is producing as much oil as is warranted from a particular area, should be eligible. But there are many types of, many areas that need to be detailed. Some need to be specifically excluded. Other costs should be specifically mentioned. So you have those clauses. In addition, you have an accounting annex to the agreement, which it goes into quite some detail in how to account for, how to report, and also what type of costs are eligible. One good thing that's happened over the years is that some standards have been developed. For example, parent company overhead. That is an old traditional topic, whether a company could say, a company producing in country A could say that our head office back in a company, call it company U, for example in the US, that head office, they do so much work for us, so we have to transfer, say, 10%, 15% of our profits to that company to show our gratitude and that we're thankful that they're helping us so much. Now, the standards have developed in most cases, so that often in the PSA or in the annex for the accounting annex, there will be a formula that you sign off to, that parent company overhead shall be maximum, say, 1.5% or a certain figure. Of course, that standardizes with the benefits of that will give you. Standardizes the type of allowance you will get for repatriating some of the money from the country in concern.
What are the sources of those standards if you're looking for?
That's a good question. I think there's been various sources. In Norway, we have a very active group, the oil and gas organization that includes most of the oil producers in Norway, and they have sought to standardize items like this. And that has happened in the dialogue with the tax authorities. So, of course, there's also this legal practice around this in many countries, where actually the court has decided that a given percentage of a parent company overhead or a given percentage of royalty for the use of particular technology can be acceptable.
Okay, thank you very much, Ola. I think we've used up our time, but I thought it was interesting that you mentioned during a couple of examples of areas of audits where one was to check out the metering, and I think we had a presentation from Brazil where they did just that a couple of years ago, where actually they did it together with Colombia and Peru as well. And I think that we had another example of the national content and looking at these joint venture companies with locals, and I think Uganda was looking into that last year as well. So it's good to see that we're on the right track in a couple of places. But thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I think if the participants have any further questions, they can address them to Ola in the break. Maybe we can take one from John.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation on production sharing agreements. Just one simple, quick question. What advice would you have for supreme audit institutions in sub-Sahara Africa who have just discovered oil? Thank you. What word of advice would you have for them, or word of encouragement, if I may put it that way?
Well, I could be direct, and in your case, carry on where you're heading, because not everyone may know, but Uganda has recently developed very, very modern, very solid legislation, and they've built a very healthy system with separation of national oil company from the national regulator, both also separated from the ministry structure in itself, and they have developed a new model petroleum sharing agreement that they're using, and of course all of this has tied in with the extremely fortunate situation of, actually that can be debated whether it's fortunate to find a lot of oil or not, because we see in so many cases that oil, as in some cases mineral wealth, transforms the country, not only in a good way. So you have to be alert, and you have to be keep developing your legislative framework, and be very responsive to things that happen in the market, that happen in society, in your country. I'm saying Uganda now, but this applies to all other countries. To be quick to react to anything that happens of development that you don't want. And for you as supreme audit institutions, that you have to point these things out for the authorities to make changes as appropriate, because it's not a given that the millions of barrels of oil under the Lake Albert, for example, in Uganda, or in the sea outside of Angola, the gas outside of Mozambique, and so on. It's not a given that will bring only happiness to the nation. What we know is that there will be a lot of money, even at low oil prices. There will be a lot of money involved, and with a lot of money, there's always a lot of risk. And so it's not a pillow to sleep on, you could say. It's rather a reason to act and to react to any changes, and to try to always be alert to the needs. I don't know if that makes sense, but I hope so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ole. Please give him a big hand.